A billionaire CEO bet a small-town mechanic she'd marry him if he could fix what her PhD engineers couldn't. What happened next will change how you see intelligence forever. When Marcus walked into that Chicago boardroom, everyone was laughing. An hour later, nobody was making a sound, except for the engine that had been impossible to fix. This isn't just about machines. It's about respect, wisdom, and why the person you're quickest to dismiss might be exactly who you need to listen to. If this story opened your eyes to seeing people differently, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Because somewhere in your life, there's a Marcus, someone whose wisdom you might be overlooking. Don't let pride blind you to the solutions right in front of you. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what really matters. And tell me in the comments, who's the unexpected teacher in your life that deserves more respect? Let's change how we see each other, one story at a time. You know, there are moments in life when everything you've built, everything you believe about yourself, gets tested by something you never saw coming. This is a story about one of those moments. And it starts with a woman who thought she had all the answers until she met a problem that proved her wrong. Let me tell you about Isabella Rodriguez. Picture this, a 42-year-old woman sitting at the head of a boardroom table that probably cost more than most people make in a year. Her suit is perfectly tailored, her hair pulled back in that no-nonsense way that says, "I mean business," and her eyes, well, her eyes have that sharp look of someone who's never met a challenge she couldn't conquer. Isabella is the CEO of Apex Technologies, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Chicago. When she walks into a room, conversations stop. When she speaks, people listen. And when she makes a decision, million-dollar deals get made or broken with a single word. But here's the thing about Isabella that most people don't know. She wasn't born into this world of glass towers and seven-figure salaries. No, her story started very differently. She grew up in Mesa, Arizona, in a house where the air conditioning barely worked and the car in the driveway had more rust than paint. Her father was a high school math teacher who stayed up late grading papers by lamplight because they couldn't afford a proper desk. Her mother worked night shifts at the hospital, coming home with tired eyes and aching feet, counting every dollar twice before spending it. Isabella learned early that if you wanted something in this world, you had to fight for it. And fight she did. While other kids were playing after school, Isabella was in the library, studying until the janitor turned off the lights. While her classmates worried about prom dresses, she was filling out scholarship applications and working 2 part-time jobs to save money for college. At Arizona State University, she wasn't the girl with the designer backpack or the latest phone. She was the one in the front row, asking the hard questions, staying after class to pick her professor's brains. She studied engineering while serving tables at night and tutoring other students on weekends. You see, Isabella had something burning inside her chest. It wasn't just ambition, it was hunger. The kind of hunger that doesn't let you sleep easy, that whispers in your ear that being ordinary isn't enough, that pushes you to prove, over and over again, that you belong in rooms where people like you aren't supposed to fit. And prove it she did. Her first job at Lockwood Tech in Phoenix was supposed to be entry-level, but Isabella didn't believe in entry-level. When her supervisor gave her a simple assignment, she'd come back with 3 solutions instead of 1. When older engineers dismissed her ideas, she'd stay up until 3 in the morning perfecting them, then present again the next day with data that was impossible to ignore. Promotions came fast. Respect, well, that came slower. But Isabella forced it, one successful project at a time, one perfect presentation at a time, one sharp comeback that left doubting colleagues speechless. By her mid-30s, she wasn't just climbing the corporate ladder. She was pulling up the rungs behind her so no one else could follow her path. She became known for cutting remarks that could slice through egos like a knife through paper. She had no patience for weakness, no time for hand-holding, and absolutely no tolerance for anyone who couldn't keep up with her relentless pace. When the opportunity to lead Apex Technologies came along, Isabella didn't hesitate. The company had big dreams, revolutionary engine technology, renewable energy systems that could change the world. They needed someone relentless, someone who could turn vision into reality without flinching at the obstacles. Isabella was perfect for the job. Under her leadership, Apex grew from a promising startup to a major player in just a few years. Investors loved her because she delivered results. Competitors feared her because she never showed weakness. Her employees, well, they respected her, but from a safe distance. Because Isabella Rodriguez had sharp edges, and those edges could cut you if you got too close. But success has a way of changing people, and not always for the better. The hungry girl from Mesa who had fought for every opportunity slowly became the powerful woman who forgot what it felt like to struggle. The sharp tongue that had once defended her now attacked others. The fierce intelligence that had lifted her up now looked down on those she deemed inferior. Which brings us to the morning when everything changed. Isabella sat in her corner office on the 40th floor, looking out at the Chicago skyline, when her head of engineering knocked on her door. Dr. Sarah Chun was one of the best in the business, recruited from MIT, with promises of unlimited resources and cutting-edge projects. But the expression on her face told Isabella that something was very, very wrong. Isabella, we need to talk about the prototype. The prototype, Isabella's crown jewel, her company's ticket to the history books. A revolutionary engine design that was supposed to be more efficient, more powerful than anything that had come before. 4 years of development, hundreds of millions of dollars, the brightest engineering minds she could find. What about it? Isabella's voice carried that edge that made subordinates choose their words carefully. It's not working. We've been trying for 4 weeks straight, round the clock. Our best people have run every test, checked every component, run thousands of computer simulations. But every time we try to start it, Sarah's voice trailed off. Every time you try to start it, what? It fails, stalls, sputters, shuts down completely. We can't figure out what's wrong. Isabella felt something cold settle in her stomach. This engine wasn't just important. It was everything. Investor presentations had been built around it. Marketing campaigns were waiting for its success. Her reputation, her company's future, it all hinged on this machine working. Get more engineers on it. Bring in consultants. I don't care what it costs. We've tried that. Isabella, these are PhD engineers from the best schools in the country. If they can't fix it, then find someone who can. That's when Sarah said something that would change everything, though neither of them knew it at the time. Actually, there might be someone. One of our junior engineers has a cousin in Detroit. Had car trouble when he was visiting family. And apparently there's this mechanic who fixed something that had stumped 3 different shops. The way Tom describes it, this guy thinks differently. Approaches problems in ways that, well, that engineers like us might not consider. Isabella stared at her. You're suggesting we call a mechanic? To fix a multi-million-dollar prototype that our best engineers can't solve. I know how it sounds, but it sounds ridiculous. Isabella's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. We have the best minds in the industry working on this. And you want to bring in someone who changes oil for a living. But even as she said it, Isabella's mind was working. Not because she thought a mechanic could actually help. That was absurd. But because she saw an opportunity. A chance to remind her team why they needed her leadership. Why her standards were so high. Why not everyone was qualified to sit her table. Fine, she said, a plan forming in her mind. Set it up. Bring him in. Sarah looked surprised. Really? You want me to contact him? Oh, yes. I want the entire engineering team there when he tries and fails. Sometimes people need to see what happens when you lower your standards. Sometimes they need a reminder of why we only work with the best. Isabella smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who thought she was about to teach a lesson. She had no idea she was about to learn one instead. Because sometimes the person you're planning to humiliate is exactly the person who's going to humble you. Sometimes the joke you're setting up becomes the mirror that shows you who you've really become. And sometimes the engine that won't start is trying to teach you something about respect, about listening, about the difference between being smart and being wise. Isabella Rodriguez was about to discover that difference. She just didn't know it yet. The stage was set. The corporate boardroom with its polished table and floor-to-ceiling windows. The broken prototype that had defeated the best minds money could buy. And one proud CEO who thought she was about to prove a point. But here's what Isabella didn't understand yet. The most powerful lessons in life often come from the people we least expect to teach us. And the person walking toward her boardroom from Detroit was carrying more than just a toolbox. He was carrying the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from textbooks or degrees. The kind that comes from listening, from patience, from treating every problem and every person with the respect they deserve. The challenge was set. The pride was in place. And the lesson of a lifetime was about to begin. But first, someone had to make a very long drive from Detroit to Chicago, carrying nothing but his tools, his experience, and a quiet confidence that would soon shake the foundations of everything Isabella thought she knew about intelligence, about respect, and about what it really means to solve problems. The engine was waiting. The room was prepared. And the story that would change two lives forever was about to unfold. Are you ready to see what happened when pride met humility? When corporate power faced quiet wisdom? When the impossible problem met the unexpected solution? Because what happened next would teach everyone in that room, and everyone hearing this story, that sometimes the most important fixes aren't about machines at all. They're about people. They're about respect. And they're about remembering that true intelligence comes in many different forms. The challenge was set. Now it was time for the outsider to arrive. 3 days later, while Isabella was perfecting her plan to humiliate a mechanic she'd never met, that mechanic was standing in his family's garage in Detroit, staring at a phone call that would change his life. Let me tell you about Marcus Washington. If you drove down Prospect Avenue on the east side of Detroit, you'd see a lot of boarded-up windows, empty lots where houses used to stand, and dreams that got buried under years of economic hardship. But right there on the corner, like a beacon of hope that refused to give up, you'd find Washington Family Auto Repair. The building wasn't much to look at. The paint on the sign had been peeling for so long that most people couldn't remember what color it used to be. The parking lot was more cracks than pavement, and the waiting room had exactly 2 chairs that creaked every time someone sat down. But if you lived in that neighborhood, and your car was your lifeline to work, to family, to hope itself, then Washington's was more than a garage. It was a sanctuary. Marcus grew up breathing the smell of motor oil and listening to the sound of engines coming back to life. His earliest memories weren't of cartoons or playground games. They were of standing on a wooden crate next to his grandfather, watching those weathered hands work magic on machines that everyone else had given up on. "Listen to her, boy," his grandfather would say, tilting his head toward an engine that sounded sick. "She's trying to tell you something. Cars don't lie. They can't. They just hurt until someone cares enough to make them whole again." By the time Marcus was 10, he could change a tire faster than most adults. By 16, he could take apart an engine block and put it back together blindfolded. His teachers kept telling him he was smart enough for college, smart enough to get out of this neighborhood and make something of himself. But Marcus never saw anything small about what his family did. When Mrs. Johnson's 15-year-old Honda wouldn't start, and she didn't have money for a new car or even a big repair bill, his grandfather would find a way to fix it for $20 and a promise to take care of herself. When the high school kid down the block needed his motorcycle running so he could get to his after-school job, Marcus would stay late, working by the light of a single bulb, until that engine purred. You see, the Washington family didn't just fix cars. They fixed hope. They fixed dignity. They fixed the thing that let working people keep working, parents keep providing, dreamers keep dreaming. After high school, while his classmates scattered to colleges in bigger cities, Marcus stayed. Not because he couldn't leave, but because he understood something that maybe those college-bound kids didn't. Sometimes the most important work happens in places the world forgets about. Life wasn't easy. Some weeks, the bills came faster than the customers. Some months, Marcus had to choose between buying new tools or buying groceries. There were nights when he'd lie awake wondering if he was fooling himself, if he should have listened to those teachers and chased something that looked more impressive on paper. But then morning would come, and with it would come people who needed him. The single mother whose transmission was making that grinding sound. The elderly man whose car was the only way he could visit his wife in the nursing home. The teenager saving up for college who needed his beat-up sedan to last just one more year. And Marcus would get to work, not because he had to, but because he understood something fundamental about respect. You don't earn respect by looking down on people's problems. You earn it by caring enough to solve them, no matter how small they might seem to the outside world. That's what made Marcus different. He didn't just listen to engines. He listened to people. When someone tried to describe a strange noise with words like clunk clunk or whirr worry, he didn't roll his eyes or make them feel stupid. He listened. He asked questions. He cared. Tell me more about that sound, he'd say, leaning in like they were sharing the most important secret in the world. When does it happen? What does it remind you of? And somehow, through that patience, through that respect, he'd figure out problems that had stumped shops with fancier equipment and higher prices. Word gets around in neighborhoods like that. People started driving from across the city to bring their cars to the quiet mechanic who actually listened. The one who never made you feel stupid for not knowing what a timing belt was. The one who explained everything in words you could understand and never charged you for something you didn't need. That reputation is what brought Tom Chin to Marcus's shop that day. Tom was visiting his family in Detroit, driving his sister's car, when it just died in the middle of traffic. 3 different shops had looked at it. 3 different mechanics had given him 3 different expensive estimates. But Tom's cousin, who lived in the neighborhood, said there was one more place he should try. Marcus had the car running in 45 minutes. Not because he was smarter than those other mechanics. Not because he had better equipment. But because he took the time to listen. To really listen. To what the engine was saying. To what the owner was worried about. To what the problem actually was instead of what it might be. Tom was amazed. More than amazed. He was an engineer himself, worked for a big tech company in Chicago, and he'd never seen anyone diagnose a problem so quickly, so accurately, so simply. How did you know? Tom asked, watching Marcus clean his hands on a rag that had seen 1,000 repairs. The engine told me, Marcus said with that half smile he got when people asked that question. You just have to know how to listen. That night, Tom called his supervisor at Apex Technologies and told him about the mechanic who thought like an engineer but worked with the intuition of an artist. He described the way Marcus approached problems, not with complexity, but with patience. Not with theories, but with respect. Which brings us back to that phone call. Marcus was underneath a 2008 Chevy, replacing a starter that had given up the ghost, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, polished, and completely out of place in his world. Mr. Washington? This is Jennifer from Apex Technologies in Chicago. We have an unusual request. Marcus slid out from under the car, wiping his hands. I'm listening. We have a prototype engine that our engineering team can't get running. I know this sounds strange, but one of our employees recommended you. Would you be willing to take a look at it? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. This had to be some kind of mistake. Ma'am, I work on cars. Regular cars. I'm not sure what help I'd be with some high-tech prototype. The gentleman who recommended you said, you have a unique approach to problem solving. We're desperate. Would you consider coming to Chicago? We'd cover all your expenses, of course. Something in her voice told Marcus this wasn't a joke. These people were really stuck, really needed help. And if there was one thing Marcus had never been able to turn his back on, it was people who genuinely needed help. When, he asked. 2 days later, Marcus was loading his toolbox into the back of his pickup truck. It was the same toolbox his grandfather had carried, filled with tools that 3 generations of Washington men had used to solve problems, to fix what was broken, to make things whole again. The drive to Chicago gave him time to think. Time to wonder what he'd gotten himself into. He'd never been inside a corporate office, never worn a suit, never sat in a meeting where people used words like prototype and engineering specifications. What if he couldn't help? What if he just embarrassed himself and wasted everyone's time? But then he thought about his grandfather's voice. Engines don't lie, boy. They just hurt until someone cares enough to make them whole again. Maybe it didn't matter whether the engine was in a beat-up Honda or a $1 million prototype. Maybe problems were problems, and fixing was fixing. The Apex Technologies building rose from downtown Chicago like a glass and steel monument to success. Marcus had to circle the block twice just to find the parking garage, and when he did, he felt his truck looked awfully small next to all those luxury cars with their perfect paint and monthly payment plans that probably cost more than most people's rent. In the elevator, surrounded by people in pressed shirts and expensive shoes, Marcus caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. His work shirt was clean, but wrinkled from the long drive. His jeans had permanent stains that no amount of washing would ever remove. His boots were steel-toed and practical, built for standing on concrete floors, not walking across marble lobbies. He looked exactly like what he was, a working man in a world that wasn't built for working men. The elevator stopped at the 40th floor, and Marcus stepped into a reception area that looked like something from a magazine. Everything was white and chrome and perfect. The receptionist looked up from her desk with a smile that seemed polite but surprised. "Marcus Washington?" she asked, like she was double-checking that the right person had somehow wandered into the wrong building. "Yes, ma'am. Ms. Rodriguez is waiting for you in the main conference room. Down the hall, last door on your right." Marcus walked down a hallway lined with awards and patents and photographs of important-looking people shaking hands with other important-looking people. His footsteps echoed despite his efforts to walk quietly. At the end of the hall, he paused outside a door marked Conference Room A. Through the glass, he could see a long table surrounded by people in suits. At the head of the table sat a woman who looked like she'd never met a challenge she couldn't conquer. This was it. The moment when two worlds collided. When a mechanic from Detroit walked into the boardroom of one of Chicago's most successful tech companies. Marcus knocked once, then pushed open the door. The conversation stopped instantly. 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at him, and Marcus felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. He saw the quick glances at his clothes, the subtle eyebrow raises, the barely hidden smirks. But he also saw something else. In the center of the room, on a rolling platform, was the most complex engine he'd ever laid eyes on. Wires and panels and components that looked like they belonged on a spaceship rather than under the hood of a car. And even from across the room, even surrounded by all that intimidating technology, Marcus could sense something about that engine. Something that felt wrong. "Mr. Washington, I presume?" The voice came from the woman at the head of the table. Her tone was polite on the surface, but underneath it carried something else. Something that sounded like amusement. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Marcus. Isabella Rodriguez, CEO of Apex Technologies. I have to say, this is quite unusual for us. We don't typically call on mechanics for our engineering problems." The way she said mechanics made it sound like something small, something lesser. Around the table, a few people chuckled softly. Marcus nodded, his expression unchanged. "I understand, ma'am. I'm just here because someone thought I might be able to help." "Help?" Isabella leaned back in her leather chair, and Marcus could see her settling into what felt like a performance. "Yes, well, let me explain the situation. This is a revolutionary engine prototype. 4 years of development. Hundreds of millions of dollars. The brightest engineering minds we could hire. PhD engineers from MIT, Stanford, Caltech. And for 4 weeks, they've been working around the clock trying to get it to function properly." She gestured to the men and women around the table. "These are the best and brightest in their field, Mr. Washington. People who understand thermodynamics and computer modeling and advanced materials science." Marcus looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. He saw intelligence there, yes, but he also saw frustration. Exhaustion, the kind of tired that comes from beating your head against the same wall over and over again. "I'm sure they are," Marcus said quietly. "So you can understand," Isabella continued, her voice getting sharper, "why it might seem a bit optimistic to think that someone from a garage in Detroit could solve what they haven't been able to." The room got quieter. The mockery was becoming less subtle, more direct. Marcus felt it, but he didn't flinch. He'd heard this song before, in different keys from different people. The song that said he didn't belong, didn't measure up, should know his place and stay in it. But Marcus had learned something over the years. He'd learned that the loudest voices weren't always the wisest ones. And he learned that sometimes the people who talked the most about how smart they were had stopped listening to anything but the sound of their own voices. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and respectful, "I didn't come here to prove anything to anybody. I came here because someone told me you had a problem that needed solving. If you'd rather I leave, I understand. But if you want me to take a look at that engine, I'm willing to try." There was something in his tone that made the room pause. Not arrogance, not defensiveness, just certainty. The quiet confidence of a man who knew what he was capable of, regardless of what anyone else thought. Isabella studied him for a long moment. This wasn't going quite the way she'd planned. She'd expected him to be intimidated, flustered, maybe even grateful for the opportunity to be in the same room as her engineering team. Instead, he stood there calm, as still water, waiting for her to make a decision. That's when she said the words that would change everything. The words she thought would put him in his place and prove her point once and for all. "All right then, Mr. Washington. Here's what we'll do." She leaned forward, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "If you can fix this engine right here, right now, in front of everyone," she paused for dramatic effect, "I'll marry you." The room erupted in laughter. Not the polite chuckling from before, but real laughter. The kind that stings. The kind that's meant to put someone in their place and keep them there. But Marcus didn't laugh. He didn't blush or stammer or back down. He just looked at Isabella Rodriguez, this powerful woman who thought she was teaching him a lesson, and said something that made the laughter die in everyone's throats. "Careful what you promise, ma'am." Words have a way of circling back. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the silence of judgment or mockery. It was the silence of surprise. Of a room full of people suddenly realizing that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated the quiet man with grease under his fingernails. Isabella felt something shift in the air, something she didn't quite understand. For the first time in years, she wasn't entirely sure she was in control of the situation. But she was in too deep to back down now. "All right then," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of uncertainty that she quickly covered with bravado. "Show us what you can do." Marcus nodded once, then walked over to the engine that had defeated the best minds money could buy. He set his simple toolbox on the floor, knelt down beside the machine, and began to do something that no one in that room had done in weeks. He began to listen. The real test was about to begin. Not just a test of Marcus's ability to fix a broken engine, but a test of everything everyone in that room believed about intelligence, about worth, about who deserves respect and who doesn't. The mechanic from Detroit was about to teach the corporate executives of Chicago a lesson they'd never forget. But first, he had to prove that sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest solutions. And sometimes, the person who looks most out of place is exactly the person you need. The engine was waiting. The room was watching. And the moment of truth was about to arrive. Have you ever been in a room so quiet that you could hear your own heartbeat? That's what it felt like in that boardroom, as Marcus Washington knelt beside the engine that had broken the spirits of a dozen brilliant engineers. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, heavy with expectation and doubt. 12 pairs of eyes watched every move he made, some hopeful, most skeptical, all waiting to see if the man with grease under his fingernails could do what their degrees and expertise couldn't. Marcus didn't seem to notice the pressure. He pulled a small flashlight from his toolbox, not some fancy diagnostic computer, not a tablet loaded with schematics, just a simple flashlight that had probably seen 1,000 repairs. He clicked it on and began to examine the engine with the same careful attention he'd give to Mrs. Johnson's old Honda. "What's he even doing?" whispered one of the younger engineers to his colleague. "He doesn't have the specifications. He doesn't know the programming protocols." But Marcus heard the whisper, and without looking up, he said something that made everyone lean forward. "Engines all speak the same language. Some just whisper in ways you haven't learned to listen to yet." Dr. Sarah Chun, the head of engineering who had first suggested calling Marcus, found herself holding her breath. She'd been working on this prototype for months. She'd run computer simulations, stress tests, thermal analysis, every tool in the modern engineer's arsenal. And here was this mechanic, running his fingers along wires like he was reading Braille, tilting his head like the machine was telling him secrets. Isabella watched from her chair at the head of the table, her arms crossed, that mocking smile still playing at her lips. But underneath the confidence, something else was stirring. A memory from long ago of her father bent over the hood of their old station wagon, explaining how engines worked with the patience of someone who truly loved understanding how things fit together. She pushed the memory away. This was different. This was business. This was about proving a point. Marcus pulled the flashlight closer to a section of wiring, his brow furrowed in concentration. The engine looked like a mechanical maze. Wires running everywhere, sensors attached to components that most people couldn't even name, computer chips that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. But Marcus wasn't intimidated by the complexity. If anything, he seemed to be looking through it, past all the fancy additions, down to the heart of what an engine really was, a machine designed to create controlled explosions that could be turned into motion. The basics are always the same, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Air, fuel, spar timing. Everything else is just decoration. One of the senior engineers, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and an MIT doctorate, scoffed under his breath. This is ridiculous. He's treating a revolutionary prototype like it's some lawnmower he found in a garage sale. Marcus looked up at him then, and his expression was kind but firm. Sir, with respect, a machine doesn't care how much it cost or how many degrees went into designing it. It either works or it doesn't. And right now, it's trying to tell us why it doesn't. He went back to his examination, running his hands along the housing, tapping gently with the back of his wrench. Each tap produced a slightly different sound, and Marcus was listening to every note like a musician tuning an instrument. Too tight here, he said, pointing to a section where the wiring harness was clamped down. This is fighting against the current instead of guiding it. The engineers exchanged glances. They designed that clamping system according to precise specifications. It had been tested and retested in computer models. Marcus loosened the clamp, creating just a bit more space for the wiring to breathe. Then he moved to another section, his flashlight revealing what looked like a small crack in one of the components. There, he said quietly. Found you. Everyone crowded closer. The crack was tiny, barely visible even under direct light. It was in the intake manifold, a hairline fracture that would be almost impossible to spot unless you were looking for exactly that kind of failure. How do we miss that? Dr. Chen whispered. Marcus looked at her with those patient eyes. Because you were looking for complicated problems. Sometimes the biggest issues hide behind the smallest mistakes. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about problem solving. But Marcus wasn't done. He'd found one problem, but his experience told him there was probably more. Broken things rarely broke in just one place. Like a chain under stress, once one link failed, others usually followed. He traced the wiring from the cracked manifold back toward the main control unit, his fingers following each path with the thoroughness of someone who understood that shortcuts led to more problems down the road. Here's the second issue, he said, pointing to where several wires had been routed against the engine housing. Whoever installed this ran the sensor wiring too close to the heat source. Every time the engine tries to start, the heat interferes with the signals. The computer doesn't know what it's hearing, so it shuts everything down to prevent damage. Isabella found herself leaning forward despite her skepticism. You're saying our engineers installed the wiring wrong? Marcus glanced at her, and there was no judgment in his voice, no mockery of the kind she had shown him. I'm saying whoever installed it prioritized, making it look clean over making it work right. Sometimes what looks perfect on paper doesn't work in the real world. The senior engineer with the wire-rimmed glasses was shaking his head. This is impossible. We followed the specifications exactly. Every wire placement was calculated using advanced modeling software. I'm sure it was, Marcus said gently. But modeling software can't tell you what the engine feels when it's running. It can't hear the vibration that loosens a clamp over time, or predict how heat expansion affects wire positioning after 100 start cycles. He stood up, wiping his hands on his work rag. The crack in the manifold is causing pressure loss. The misplaced wiring is sending confused signals to the control computer. Fix both of those, and she should run just fine. The room fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of skepticism. It was the silence of people realizing they'd been overthinking a problem that required not more complexity, but more wisdom. Dr. Chun spoke first. The replacement manifold is right here. We have spares. Her voice carried a mixture of hope and disbelief. And rerouting the wiring will take maybe 20 minutes, added one of the younger engineers. Marcus nodded. Mind if I do it? I like to see this through. Isabella watched him work with growing amazement. His movements were efficient but never hurried. He treated each component with respect, like it mattered, like it deserved his full attention. When he removed the cracked manifold, he examined it carefully, understanding not just that it had failed, but why it had failed. Stress fracture, he explained to the engineers gathered around him. Probably started small and grew over time. In a regular car, you might not notice it for months. But in a precision system like this, even a tiny leak throws everything off. As he installed the replacement part, he talked them through his process. Not lecturing, not showing off, just sharing what he'd learned through years of fixing things that other people had given up on. The key, he said, carefully torquing a bolt to just the right tightness, is to remember that every part of the system depends on every other part. You can't just look at one component in isolation. You have to understand how it talks to everything else. While he worked on a manifold, one of the younger engineers began rerouting the problematic wiring under Marcus's guidance. It was a simple fix, really, just moving the sensor wires away from the heat source and securing them with proper clips. But it required understanding not just where the wires needed to go, but why they needed to go there. Engines get hot, Marcus explained as they worked. Wires expand and contract. Over time, things shift. You have to plan for that, give everything room to move and breathe. Isabella found herself drawn into the process despite her initial skepticism. She watched Marcus's hands as he worked. Hands that were scarred from years of fixing things. Hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had solved thousands of problems by refusing to give up on them. You make it look so easy, she said, surprised to hear herself speaking. Marcus glanced at her. It's not easy, but it's not magic either. It's just paying attention. Most people are in too much of a hurry to listen to what the machine is trying to tell them. There was something in his tone that made her pause. No accusation, no criticism of her or her team. Just a simple truth spoken by someone who had learned it through experience. How long have you been doing this? She asked. Fixing things? My whole life. My grandfather taught me when I was barely tall enough to see over the hood of a car. He used to say that every broken thing is just waiting for someone who cares enough to understand it. The room had grown quieter as people stopped their side conversations and started really listening to what Marcus was saying. Here was a philosophy of problem solving that none of them had learned in school, but all of them recognized as profound. Almost done, Marcus said, making the final connections on the rerouted wiring. He stepped back and surveyed his work, checking each connection one more time. Sometimes the best fix is the one nobody notices because it just works the way it was supposed to work in the first place. The prototype engine sat there, looking almost exactly the same as it had an hour ago. But Marcus had changed everything that mattered. The cracked manifold had been replaced. The confused wiring had been rerouted. The machine that had frustrated brilliant minds for weeks had been restored to wholeness by a mechanic who understood that complexity was often just simplicity that had been overthought. Want to try starting it? Marcus asked, looking at Dr. Chun. She nodded, moving to the control panel with hands that trembled slightly. This prototype represented years of her life, months of sleepless nights, the weight of a company's future resting on its success. The engineers gathered around, their earlier skepticism replaced by nervous hope. Isabella stood at the head of the table, her arms no longer crossed, her expression no longer mocking. Here goes, Dr. Chin whispered and pressed the start button. For a moment, the familiar sputter filled the room. The same sound they'd heard dozens of times before, the sound of failure that had become the soundtrack to their frustration. But then something different happened. The sputter smoothed out. The engine caught. And instead of the silence of another failure, the room filled with the steady, strong rhythm of a machine that was finally, beautifully, perfectly alive. The prototype engine was running. Not just running, but purring. The sound was smooth and confident, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Every gauge showed green. Every system showed optimal function. The machine that had defeated the best minds money could hire was working exactly as it had been designed to work. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had filled that room before. It was the silence of awe, of disbelief, of a dozen brilliant people realizing that sometimes the most important intelligence isn't the kind that comes from textbooks. Marcus stood quietly beside the engine, no smile of triumph, no gesture of victory, just a man who had done what he came to do, who had listened to a machine that was crying for help and had given it exactly what it needed. And in that moment, everyone in that room, from the junior engineers to the department heads to the CEO herself, understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the fixing of an engine, but the demonstration of a different way of thinking about problems. A way that valued patience over pressure, understanding over assumption, respect over ego. The lesson was still unfolding, but its foundation had been laid. The quiet man from Detroit had proven that wisdom comes in many forms, and sometimes the person you least expect to succeed is exactly the person you need. But the real impact of what had just happened was still to come, because changing a machine is one thing. Changing the people who witness that change, that's something else entirely. And Isabella Rodriguez, sitting at the head of that boardroom table, listening to the steady rhythm of an engine that shouldn't have been able to run, was about to discover that some lessons change everything. The engine was running, the room was stunned, and the story was about to reach its most powerful moment yet. You know what the most powerful sound in the world is? It's not applause or cheering or celebration. It's the sound of silence when something impossible becomes possible right in front of your eyes. That's the sound that filled the Apex Technologies boardroom as the prototype engine purred to life, steady and strong, after weeks of failure. The silence of a dozen brilliant minds realizing that everything they thought they knew about intelligence, about expertise, about who deserves respect, had just been turned upside down by a quiet mechanic from Detroit. For 30 seconds, maybe more, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They just stood there, listening to the most beautiful sound they'd heard in months, the sound of success. Then, like a dam bursting, the silence broke. "It's working," whispered Dr. Sarah Chun, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's actually working." One of the younger engineers rushed to the diagnostic computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard. All systems green. Pressure optimal. Temperature stable. I can't believe it. Another engineer, the woman who had been quietly watching Marcus's every move, shook her head in amazement. For weeks we've been trying everything, and he fixed it in an hour." But it was the senior engineer with the wire-rimmed glasses who spoke the words that cut deepest. The man who had scoffed at Marcus from the beginning, who had muttered about this being ridiculous, who had been so sure that degrees mattered more than understanding. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you see what we missed?" Marcus looked at him, and there wasn't a trace of smugness in his expression. "No, I told you so." No victory lap, just the calm kindness of someone who understood what it felt like to be humbled. "You didn't miss anything," Marcus said gently. "You just got so focused on the complex possibilities that you stopped seeing the simple realities. Sometimes the hardest problems to solve are the ones hiding in plain sight." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through everyone in the room, because they all recognized the truth in what he was saying. They had been so determined to find a sophisticated solution worthy of their advanced degrees that they'd overlooked the basic engineering principles their professors had taught them in their very first classes. Dr. Chun moved closer to the engine, studying the repairs Marcus had made. "The crack in a manifold. We should have caught that in our initial inspection. The wiring placement," another engineer added, trailing off as he realized how obvious the problem seemed now that it was fixed. "We were so concerned with making it look clean in the prototype photos. We forgot that form should follow function," finished the younger engineer, the shame evident in his voice. But Marcus wasn't interested in making anyone feel worse than they already did. "Look," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had made plenty of mistakes himself. "Every good mechanic I know has stories about the simple fix they missed because they were looking for something complicated. It's part of learning. The key is remembering that machines don't care about our egos. They just want to work." Isabella sat at the head of the table, watching this exchange with a growing sense of vertigo. The carefully constructed world she'd built around herself, where intelligence was measured by degrees, where expertise was proven by titles, where she sat at the top because she was simply better than everyone else. That world was cracking like the manifold Marcus had just replaced. She thought about the bet she'd made, the mocking words she'd thrown at him like weapons designed to cut him down to size. "Fix this engine and I'll marry you." She'd said it to humiliate him, to prove that he didn't belong in her world. But now the engine was running, and her words hung in the air like a debt that demanded payment. The engineers continued to crowd around the prototype, checking readings, confirming what their eyes and ears were already telling them. Marcus had done the impossible. He had solved in 1 hour what their best efforts couldn't solve in 4 weeks. "The pressure readings are better than our best projections," one of them reported. "Temperature regulation is perfect," added another. "I'm getting data flows we never achieved in any of our test runs," said the woman at the computer terminal. Each report was another confirmation of Marcus's success and another reminder of their failure. But Marcus seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He began packing his tools back into his worn toolbox, the same methodical care he'd shown when unpacking them. "Where are you going?" asked Dr. Chen. "Back to Detroit," Marcus replied simply. "My work here is done. You got a good engine now. Just remember to listen to it." That's when Isabella found her voice. "Wait." The word came out sharper than she intended, carrying all the authority she was used to wielding. "You can't just leave." Marcus paused, his hand on his toolbox handle. "Ma'am, I came here to help if I could. I did what I was asked to do. The engine runs. Your team can take it from here. But we need to understand how you did it. We need to learn from this." Something flickered across Marcus's expression. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than his previous calm politeness. Dr. Chun and her team are good engineers. They just got caught up in overthinking the problem. Now that they know what to look for, they won't make the same mistakes again. He was being generous, Isabella realized. He could have made them all feel foolish, could have lectured them about their assumptions and prejudices. Instead, he was giving them a graceful way to learn and move forward. But Isabella wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet, because something inside her, something she'd buried under years of sharp words and sharper ambitions, was demanding that she face what had just happened. "Mr. Washington," she said, standing up from her chair. The room went quiet again, everyone sensing that something important was about to happen. "Yes, ma'am. You made us all look like fools today." The words hung in the air, heavy with potential conflict. Several of the engineers tensed, waiting to see if their CEO was about to lash out, to find some way to diminish what Marcus had accomplished. But then Isabella continued, her voice softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "Not because you showed off or made us feel stupid, but because you reminded us how stupid we were acting." The admission hit the room like a physical force. Isabella Rodriguez, the woman who never backed down, never admitted weakness, never showed anything that could be interpreted as vulnerability, was acknowledging that she had been wrong. "We spent 4 weeks trying to prove how smart we were," she continued, her eyes locked on Marcus. "You spent 1 hour actually being smart. There's a difference, and we all know it now." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that surprised him. Not the sharp-edged CEO who had mocked him when he walked in, but someone else. Someone who looked like she was remembering what it felt like to be humble. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "intelligence isn't about being right all the time. It's about being willing to learn when you're wrong." The words were gentle, but they carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, and everyone in that room felt them. Dr. Chun was the first to speak. "Marcus, Mr. Washington, thank you. For fixing the engine, yes, but also for showing us how to think about problems differently." One by one, the other engineers added their voices to hers. Not just thanks, but genuine appreciation for a lesson they hadn't known they needed to learn. "You've changed how I'm going to approach diagnostics from now on," said the younger engineer. "I'm going to remember to listen more and assume less," added another. Even the senior engineer with the wire-rimmed glasses, the one who had been most skeptical, stepped forward. "Mr. Washington, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on what I thought I knew instead of giving you a chance to show what you actually knew. Marcus nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he'd shown throughout the entire experience. We all make assumptions, sir. The trick is being willing to let them go when they stop serving us. But it was Isabella who surprised everyone the most. She walked around the conference table, past her senior staff, past the engineers who had worked for her for years, and extended her hand to Marcus. I was wrong, she said simply. About you. About what intelligence looks like. About who deserves respect in this room. Marcus took her hand, and for a moment, the CEO and the mechanic stood as equals. Two people who had both learned something important about themselves that day. We were all wrong about something today, Marcus replied. The good news is being wrong is just the first step toward being right. The handshake lasted longer than a normal business courtesy. Long enough for Isabella to feel the calluses on Marcus's palms, the evidence of years of honest work. Long enough for her to remember her father's hands, similarly marked by labor and care. Marcus would always make time for them, the same way his grandfather had made time for him. He'd show them how to listen to an engine, how to feel for problems with their hands, as well as diagnose them with their minds, how to respect the wisdom that comes from experience. The thing about machines, he would tell them, his hands demonstrating while his voice taught, is that they're honest. They can't lie to you about what's wrong, but they can only tell you the truth if you know how to listen. One young woman, a mechanical engineering major from Wayne State University, became a regular visitor. She'd grown up in the neighborhood and was working her way through college, just like Isabella had years before, but with a very different understanding of where wisdom could be found. Mr. Washington, she asked one afternoon while helping him replace a transmission, how do you know when to stop looking for complicated solutions and start looking for simple ones? Marcus paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. When you catch yourself trying to prove how smart you are instead of trying to solve the actual problem. The moment you start working to impress people instead of working to fix things, that's when you know you've lost your way. It was exactly the kind of wisdom Isabella's engineers had been missing, the kind that can't be taught in textbooks, but has to be learned through experience, through humility, through the willingness to put the work before the ego. The story of that day in Chicago had spread through both of their worlds in different ways. In Isabella's corporate circles, it had become a parable about the dangers of arrogance and the value of diverse perspectives. In Marcus's neighborhood, it had become a reminder that their skills and knowledge mattered, that the work they did had value beyond what the outside world might recognize. But perhaps the most powerful impact was on the young engineers who heard about it, who were just starting their careers and still deciding what kind of professionals they wanted to become. They learned early that intelligence wasn't about having the right degree or working for the right company. It was about approaching problems with respect, with patience, with the humility to learn from anyone who had something to teach. One evening, almost exactly a year after that transformative day, Isabella found herself in an unexpected place, sitting in her car in the parking lot of the technical college on the south side of Chicago, waiting to give a guest lecture to a group of automotive technology students. A year ago, she would never have accepted such an invitation. Technical college students? Automotive technology? What could she, the CEO of a high-tech company, possibly learn from or teach to people training for blue-collar jobs? But now she understood. These students were learning the same fundamental principles that Marcus had demonstrated that day. They were learning to listen, to diagnose with their hands as well as their minds, to respect the wisdom that comes from understanding how things actually work. Her lecture that night wasn't about corporate strategy or advanced engineering theory. It was about the day she learned to listen, about the mechanic who taught her that wisdom comes in many forms, about the dangerous pride that makes us dismiss people whose knowledge looks different from our own. After the lecture, a young man approached her. His name was James, and he was studying to become a diesel mechanic while working nights to pay for school. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence she remembered from Marcus. Thank you for that story. Most people look at what we do and think it's simple work for simple people. It means a lot to hear someone like you say that intelligence comes in different forms. Isabella looked at this young man, Earnest, hard-working, dedicated to learning a trade that kept the world moving, and saw something that took her breath away. She saw Marcus at that age. She saw her father bend over that old station wagon. She saw herself fighting to prove that she belonged in rooms where people like her weren't supposed to fit. "James," she said, and her voice carried all the sincerity she had learned to value over the past year. "Never let anyone make you feel like what you do doesn't matter. The world runs on the work of people who know how to fix things. Don't let anyone convince you that working with your hands is somehow less important than working with a computer." She paused, remembering Marcus's words from that day in the boardroom. "Intelligence isn't about what you know. It's about how willing you are to learn. And for what I can see, you've got that kind of intelligence in abundance." As she drove home that night, Isabella realized how far she had traveled from the person she used to be. Not just in miles from her corporate headquarters to a technical college, but in understanding, in humility, in wisdom. The sharp-edged CEO who had mocked a mechanic for thinking he could solve what her engineers couldn't have been replaced by someone who understood that respect was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but an infinite gift to be shared. But the most profound change wasn't in how she saw others. It was in how she saw herself. For years, Isabella had defined her worth by her achievements, her title, her ability to be the smartest person in the room. But Marcus had shown her a different way to measure success. Not by how much you knew, but by how much you helped. Not by how impressive you looked, but by how effectively you solved problems. Not by how high you climbed, but by how many people you lifted up along the way. The engine Marcus had fixed was still running perfectly, powering Apex's most successful product line. But the real machine he had repaired that day wasn't made of metal and wires. It was made of assumptions and prejudices, pride and fear. He had fixed something broken in the way humans see each other, in the way intelligence is valued, in the way respect is earned and given. Two people had walked into that boardroom that day. A proud CEO convinced of her own superiority, and a humble mechanic who just wanted to help. Two different people had walked out. A CEO who had learned to listen, and a mechanic who had reminded the world that wisdom comes in many forms. But the story didn't end when Marcus drove back to Detroit or when Isabella implemented new policies at her company. The real ending happens every time someone chooses to listen instead of dismiss, to respect instead of mock, to learn instead of assume. It happens every time an engineer asks a technician for advice instead of ignoring their experience. Every time a manager values practical knowledge alongside theoretical training. Every time someone in power remembers that the people they serve might have something to teach them. The story continues every time you and I remember that the person we're quickest to judge might be exactly the person we most need to learn from. So here's what I want you to take away from Marcus and Isabella's story. The next time you meet someone whose intelligence looks different from yours, whose experience comes from a different world, whose knowledge was earned in ways you might not immediately respect, pause. Listen. Ask questions instead of making assumptions. The person changing your oil might understand systems thinking better than any MBA. The custodian in your office might have insights about efficiency that your consultants missed. The teenager bagging your groceries might have perspectives on customer service that could revolutionize your business. Wisdom isn't distributed according to job titles or college degrees. It's earned through experience, through caring, through the willingness to keep learning even when the world tells you you've learned enough. Marcus Washington knew this. Isabella Rodriguez learned it. And now you know it too. The question isn't whether you're smart enough to succeed in your field. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from everyone you meet along the way. Because sometimes the most important engine that needs fixing isn't the one on the table in front of you. Sometimes it's the one inside your own heart, the one that determines how you see other people, how you value their contributions, how you choose to treat them. Marcus fixed both kinds of engines that day. He gave Isabella's company a prototype that worked, but more importantly, he gave Isabella herself a perspective that transformed not just her business, but her life. That's the real lesson here. That's the story worth telling, worth remembering, worth living. In a world that often judges people by their appearance, their accent, their job title, their zip code, choose to judge them by their character, their wisdom, their willingness to help. In a world that often dismisses the contributions of people who work with their hands, choose to value all forms of intelligence. In a world that often mistakes volume for wisdom and credentials for competence, choose to listen for the quiet voices that might be speaking the truest words. Because you never know when the person you're about to dismiss might be the one carrying exactly the solution you've been searching for. You never know when your moment of humility might become your greatest lesson. And you never know when choosing to respect someone else might be exactly what repairs something broken in your own soul. That's the lesson Marcus taught. That's the wisdom Isabella learned. And that's the story that can change the world, one conversation, one interaction, one moment of respect at a time. The engines keep running. The work continues. And somewhere, in boardrooms and garages, in schools and shops, in all the places where people meet and problems need solving, Marcus's quiet wisdom lives on. Machines don't lie. People do. People make things complicated, but a machine tells you the truth if you're patient enough to listen. Maybe it's time we started listening to each other the same way. The end.